Hello, I'm Chris Browder. This is video 10.2 in my series on second language acquisition, theory, and research. The essential question for lesson 10 is, what is the best way to learn a language? We try to answer this question by comparing learning environments and methods of instruction. In this video, we will look at some of the evidence that supports some of the practices commonly found in language classrooms. This video is largely based off of three sources. The first is Rod Ellis's text, Understanding Second Language Acquisition. The second is Lightbot and Spada's text, How Languages Are Learned. And the third is Gasbani and Plonsky's text, Second Language Acquisition and Introductory Course. In the last video, I compared different settings for learning a language. One of those settings was what we call a natural setting. In other words, we were talking about learning a language without any instructional support. So let's begin this lesson by talking about the evidence that people really can learn languages in natural settings. The best evidence for so-called natural language learning actually comes from anthropology. According to most anthropologists, multilingualism is more common for human beings than monolingualism. And this has been true long before classroom language instruction ever existed. In fact, multilingualism is actually more common in isolated and underdeveloped locations with less formal schooling than it is in developed nation states in which learning usually happens in schools. Therefore, billions of humans are successfully learning second languages all over the world without classroom instruction, and this has been true for as long as human beings have ever existed. We also know that SLA researchers have identified and studied many adult immigrants who learned second languages without formal instruction. So we have evidence that it is possible even for adults to learn languages without language classes or self-guided learning programs such as websites and textbooks. There's even research that helps explain exactly how people learn languages in natural settings without the benefits of any formal instruction. Researchers tell us that most human learning actually takes place without formal instruction. This happens when a community of people who practice a certain skill welcome a new member in and support that new member to gradually participate more and more in that skill. This is similar to apprenticeships and internships, but seems to take place naturally as a cultural universal in all human societies. We can see these communities of practice even with children, such as when children play together, welcome in a new child, and teach the new kid how to play largely just by including that kid in the game that they're playing. In fact, researchers have discovered societies in which members even learn how to read without ever receiving any formal schooling. But how does this informal learning actually happen? From what we can tell, members of those communities support the new members by to help them meaningfully participate through interactions and different kinds of support that resemble what Vygotsky called scaffolding. I'm giving this example here of a father teaching her daughter how to ride a bike because it's the most concrete and visible example. Notice at first he's supporting her, he's helping her to ride a bike. Eventually he lets go a little bit more, and eventually she's riding the bike all on her own. That is definitely scaffolding. At first, she doesn't know how to ride the bike on her own. That's the zone of proximal development. But eventually, she can do it on her own, and she doesn't need her daddy to hold her up anymore. Examples of the scaffolding for language learning in natural language learning settings are when helpful native speakers modify their speaking style to help non-native speakers understand them. Research also shows people use a variety of communicative strategies to support language learners who are struggling to speak. This is what Long referred to as the negotiation of meaning. An example of this I heard recently, I'm sorry, I'm going to steal an example from a student because it's brilliant. So an example of this I heard recently was a non-native speaker at the beach with a native speaker. The non-native speaker sat under a beach umbrella and said, "I like to sit in the shadow." The native speaker looked briefly confused and then said, "Oh, yeah, the shade. Let's sit in the shade." Right? This is negotiation of meaning because it focuses on communication and meaning, but provides the learner with corrective feedback so she can learn more. And this is kind of just a way we scaffold people to help them learn the language without teaching them the language directly. There's also actual research showing that people can learn second languages without formal instruction, just simply by natural exposure. For example, research shows that language learners can learn grammar even from listening, just from listening alone, learning grammar. Other research shows students can make large gains in vocabulary knowledge from reading alone. This is what God, I missed that one. This is what we refer to as explicit learning. As implicit learning, because the learners are learning language rules simply by exposure to language and without explicitly being taught those rules. All right, let's see. Okay, given all the evidence that language learning can happen naturally without formal instruction, one might be tempted to get rid of language classes altogether and just focus on, helping people to meaningfully participate, right? Scaffolding them. This might be a bit hasty, however, because we haven't really discussed the potential limitations of so-called natural language learning. So, for starters, we understand that natural learning takes place when members of a community of practice welcome in an outsider and support that outsider to meaningfully participate in that community. While there is evidence that native speakers can help language learners acquire their language in natural settings by using inclusive practices, we cannot assume that native speakers will always be inclusive. And we cannot assume that these inclusive practices will always take place. In fact, ethnographic research shows us that English learners are much more likely to be bullied and excluded in mainstream classrooms than welcomed and warmly included. There are also apparent limits to what people can do in the implicit and inductive learning that takes place with natural learning. For instance, research shows that language learners must already understand about 3,000 words before they can start to understand a typical TV show well enough to incidentally learn some of the other words that they don't understand. So, in other words, you're not going to learn a language by listening to TV shows unless you already have learned about 3,000. You might get some here and there, but you're just not going to get a lot. In other words, most of the language learners most of the language learners are exposed to is totally inaccessible to them unless they already have some foundational knowledge. And how do learners exactly get that foundational knowledge if they can't access what they're already hearing naturally? It's sort of like chicken and the egg kind of paradox, right? You can't have the chicken without the egg, and you can't have the egg without the chicken. So how do you get the egg if you don't have the chicken? Any observer can see that it is easier for people to make input comprehensible when the topic of the conversation is very concrete, but gets very challenging when the topic is very abstract. So, for example, I can help you understand the sentence, "Would you like a glass of water?" simply by holding out a glass of water and physically offering it to you. I can improve that experience by repeating the word water after I make the first offer. Holding it out. See, water, water. Would you like some water? But can I do the same with the sentence, "How do you feel about existentialist philosophy?" Many of the concepts adults deal with are very abstract and cannot easily be represented with visual aids. They require big words and long sentences, not just objects that are here and now in the present visibly in front of us. This might explain why very young children can learn well through inclusion in preschool and kindergarten programs, but older students report more difficulty with inclusion in upper-level courses. Any good kindergarten teacher keeps her lessons very hands-on and experiential. In kindergarten, all students learn about subjects such as shapes and colors by directly experiencing shapes and colors. That's a great way to build a strong language foundation. But now let's talk about the research on learning language in language classes. There's a big controversy in U.S. public schools right now about whether ESOL students should be pulled out for special ESOL classes or whether they should remain in their mainstream classes and learn through inclusion. Let's take a look at some of the evidence for learning in ESOL classes. For starters, we have data taken from the U.S. Census Bureau over the past 100 years. It shows that immigrants in the U.S. are learning English much, much faster than they were 100 years ago. Some people attribute this to the introduction of free English language classes and public school ESOL programs, but others attribute it just simply to increased integration. It's probably both. There's also research showing English learners generally learn English much faster when they are receiving more ESOL classes. A study by Thomas and Collier, for example, found that kindergarten English learners, or ELs as I'm going to start calling them, given ESOL classes had much higher reading test scores 5 years later than those who were not given ESOL classes. Similarly, Saunders, Foreman, and Carlson found that kindergarten English learners made greater progress in English speaking when given some pull-out ESOL classes instead of just inclusion only. Researchers have also found middle school EL students learn English much faster if they are given more ESL time. And Browder found high school ELs who are taking more sheltered ESOL courses made more progress in academic English than those who are taking fewer or no ESOL courses. Similarly, Callahan, Wilkinson, and Mueller found recent arrival immigrant EL students generally had better academic outcomes if they received more ESOL services. But what exactly is it about ESOL classes that helps English learners? If ESOL classes are run well, then they can be great places for EL students to get support for learning English. Researchers believe that ESOL classes generally benefit EL students because they provide more comprehensible input and opportunities to use English to speak, read, and write with support than what these students get in the mainstream classrooms. We also know that EL students are more likely to speak and ask questions in their ESOL classes than they are in their mainstream classes. Simply put, more opportunities to listen, read, speak, and write generally mean more opportunities to learn. But the effectiveness of language instruction probably depends on the student and, the instruction, the teacher, the classroom, etc., etc. The peers too, right? The same researchers who have shown us the benefits of LISA classes are often the same researchers who express concern that they may sometimes be inappropriate or harmful to certain students. We don't want a system in which students who have spent many years in the United States and already have the proficiency needed to access mainstream classes are segregated or sequestered indefinitely and not allowed the opportunity to participate in challenging grade level instruction. That would be a violation of their civil rights. We can only warrant these segregated ESOL classes if we know as a fact that they're in the student's best interest. There are certain instructional practices found in language classrooms that appear to benefit language learners. For example, language learners benefit a great deal from exposure to engaging but challenging comprehensible input. I'm talking about the supported reading and listening activities that often happen in high-quality language classes. We know, for example, that students can make large gains in vocabulary knowledge from reading alone as long as the reading is at the right level. Admittedly, this high-quality reading and listening work doesn't always take place. Structure-based instruction, which hopefully isn't what the ESOL teachers do, but yeah, if you focus just exclusively on structure, structure-based instruction tends to spend little time with reading and listening work because it spends so much time teaching or drilling grammar forms. Research shows that students in comprehension-based ESL instruction, that's classes that focus on reading and listening only, learn English grammar and speaking at about the same rate as students in structure-based ESL classes, even if they are never given speaking or grammar practice at all. So let's repeat that. So if you just teach grammar and never give the kids opportunities to speak, then you will be accomplishing just the same as if you just had the kids just do nothing but reading and listening. Even though those kids reading and listening never actually study grammar, they learn it just as fast through reading and listening as they do through the grammar instruction without the meaningful contextualized practice. But other research shows students in comprehension-based instruction with some class time spent discussing the reading. Just simply add some discussion in. And they can actually learn grammar faster than the students who are being taught the grammar in a structure-based class. So if we can learn grammar and speaking faster by focusing on reading and listening than by focusing on grammar, then should we even bother to teach grammar at all? Maybe we should just, have listening and reading and give the kids some time to discuss what they're listening and reading, if that seems to be better than the traditional grammar translation kind of grammar instruction method. To answer this question, we should probably look at the research on focus on form integrated with communicative practice. It seems that certain grammar forms may not be acquired well through comprehension-based instruction alone. In other words, you can't master every grammar form just by listening and reading. Some forms may require some additional grammar instruction and might even require some actual explicit instruction. So in other words, sometimes it might even be helpful or necessary to just directly teach grammar to English learners. However, research also shows us that students taught grammar in structure-based language classes won't really acquire those grammar forms and will fail to use the form correctly later during spontaneous speaking unless they're given some opportunities to practice those forms with some sort of communicative, meaning-focused practice. So, in other words, if you just teach the grammar but don't give a good communicative practice for it, then they're not going to acquire the grammar and they're not really going to get it. The solution to this dilemma seems to be the integration of grammar instruction into communicative language teaching. Researchers have found that students learn to use a form more accurately in spontaneous speaking tasks if the teaching of the form is integrated into communicative language teaching practices instead of just taught out of context without any communicative practice. This seems to suggest that grammar teaching is not a waste of time as long as it's integrated into communicative language teaching. This is something that effective language teachers do. Research shows that students in content-based instruction and sheltered content classes successfully learn both content and language from those courses, but may benefit from more focus on form in those courses than they are usually getting from their teachers. Yep. Unfortunately, most of the ESL classes are not giving students enough focus on form because most of the ESL classes are entirely content-based. We're talking about SIOP and CLIL. The teachers will focus so much on teaching the content, they forget they're teaching language. Students receiving explicit instruction paired with communicative practice can make significant gains in grammar, vocabulary, and even pronunciation. The reason why meaning-focused grammar instruction integrated into communicative language teaching is the reason why it's so effective is probably best explained by research on De Keyser's transfer appropriate processing theory. This research shows that learners can recall what they learned better later if the conditions for learning are more similar to the conditions of recall. So, if you learn grammar from a worksheet, then you'll probably use it very correctly on other worksheets later. But you might not be able to use it correctly while actually speaking and writing unless you're given some opportunity to actually practice it with speaking and writing after being taught the lesson. So in other words, the teachers have to teach the students how to apply what they learned in the classroom in out-of-classroom settings. This is probably the best justification for communicative language teaching and teaching students academic English through SIOP, CLIL, and other communicative methods that teach language through academic content subject matter. In other words, the best way to learn language forms specific to biology is to learn them in an English class that focuses on biology. So now we've got these, sheltered biology classes exclusively for ESL students that try to basically make a English language class with just biology. And this can work well, but back to what we already said, most of these teachers are not real language teachers. They don't really know how to teach language, and they just end up teaching biology, a dumbed down version of biology. So, another benefit of language classes is that, when you're in a language class, the teacher is more likely to provide you with appropriate error correction and useful feedback. Research shows that students who receive corrective feedback on a specific grammar form usually do better when tested on that form later. Admittedly, however, teachers in communicative language classes generally correct students' errors very little, and when they do, it is usually through something non-intrusive and meaning-focused, like a recast. Recasting is when you repeat the sentence the learner made, but make it correct. Like when a learner says, "I like sandwich," and the teacher says, "Oh, you like sandwiches." This may not always be effective, however. Research shows that students receiving error correction in the form of recasts often do not notice these recasts because they're focused on meaning instead of form while they're talking. The students in these classes instead benefit more from direct and sometimes even explicit forms of error correction. We now believe that learners in ESL classes that are largely communicative or content-based can acquire grammatical accuracy faster if selectively given some explicit grammar correction during those classes. As we discussed earlier, another advantage of language classes is that they sometimes give learners more opportunities to speak. One of the qualities of effective language teachers is that they are willing to give students more wait time. In other words, they will ask students a question and then wait patiently for the students to think and prepare an answer. This is important because students give longer and more complicated responses when teachers allow more wait time after asking questions. It is important that language learners have ample opportunities to practice speaking. Students who are given more time to practice using the language in communicative activities do better on speaking tests. Students also learn more from reading and listening activities when given time to discuss what they're reading or hearing. It is also beneficial to allow students opportunities to interact with other students, even if those other students are also language learners. They learn even if those are other language learners with a lower English proficiency level. Interestingly, research shows that language learners speak more in conversations with other English learners than they do in conversations with native speakers. There's also no evidence that language learners pick up each other's errors. We don't really have to worry about the situation where one English learner is speaking incorrectly and the other language learner picks up the incorrect speaking. We believe that the interaction between learners during group work also has major benefits. Students show more improvement in grammar if given opportunities to interact and experience negotiation of meaning instead of just listening. This is especially true when the language learners are assigned to group work in a group to complete a language task together. An example of this is having students work in a group to write a script or a play. Students in these collaborative groups learn from the discussions they have about what is best or what is correct and why it is correct, even if those discussions take place in their native language. So yeah, I think you're probably worried about putting kids in groups to work together, and you're worried that they're going to start speaking to each other in Spanish or whatever language, and then they're just going to be hearing Spanish and not hearing English. But there is some evidence that language learning is still taking place in those groups, even when they're speaking Spanish to each other, as long as they are sharing information or knowledge with one another about what is best in that situation for completing that task. As long as the task is an English production, English will be learned. Well, do all language teachers have these research-based best practices? Are all ESL classes great places for ESL students to learn? Should every kid classified as an English learner be in ESL classes as much as possible? No. Do inclusion and natural learning situations always lack opportunities for English language learners? No. Can we change the way mainstream classes work to give them the benefits of language classes, all these benefits that I talked about? Yes, but that's going to be hard to do. we're right now we're a long ways away from that. We're very far away from that. We're going to have to make a lot more progress if we're going to make the practices in the ESOL classes become the practices in the mainstream classes so the English learners can participate meaningfully. That's not going to happen immediately. Until then, language classes are probably in the best interest of language learners, at least some of the time. Once again, depending on the classes and depending on the learners. Thanks. I hope that this has been useful and interesting to you.